Welcome to Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark. We're in Mark chapter 14. We're going to be starting verse 19 this lesson. But before we begin, Jeremiah 15:16, thy words were found, and I did eat them, and thy word was unto me the joy and the rejoicing of my heart. Now, we're in the context in Mark chapter 14 of the Last Supper. That's verses 12 to 25. And Jesus and the disciples now are up in the upper room, and they are partaking of the Last Supper, the lamb, the bitter herbs, the wine, the unleavened bread. And he says to them in verse 18, which we saw last lesson, that one of you shall betray me. One of you that's eating with me will betray me. Now we start our lesson here in verse 19, and it says, and they began to be sorrowful, and to say unto him, one by one, is it I? And another said, is it I? Right? Now, this first phrase for is it I, the Greek phrase has a negative connotation to it, meaning that they were expecting a negative answer. So basically in modern English, for us to understand it, we would say, it's not me, is it? So Jesus' words of betrayal had so shaken them that they began to doubt their own commitment to the Lord. This can happen really to any one of us. Sometimes we go to church and we hear a message that challenges us, and we begin to doubt our commitment to Jesus, to the Bible, to the Lord. There's times when, we go to church and we hear a strong message, and it causes us to think twice about our faith and about our commitment to the Lord and to the Bible. And this is what happened when Jesus said, one of you guys betray me. It shook them up. And it says they began to be sorrowful. The disciples could see the seriousness with which Jesus spoke and his sorrow. And this caused the disciples to be sorrowful at a festival that normally would have been joyful. This should be, the Feast of Passover would have been a time of joy. But because of Jesus' words and because of seeing Jesus' sorrow in his words and in his face for what he had just said, now they become sorrowful. Now verse 20 says, and he answered and said unto them, it is one of the 12 that dips with me in the dish. Now, according to John 13, verse 26, Jesus dipped the bread and he gave it to Judas. The dipping of the bread and giving it to each guest was a very important part of the Passover meal. On the bread or in the bread would be pieces of the lamb meat, and there would be bitter herbs which would be sprinkled on it with these. So you would have a piece of bread, you would put lamb meat on it, you would sprinkle bitter herbs on the lamb meat, and you would roll the bread up, and then it would be dipped in a bitter sauce. Then it would be handed to each guest. So it seems that the head of the family, or the head of the leader in the group, he would take a piece of unleavened bread, he would put lamb meat on it, roasted lamb meat, then he would sprinkle bitter herbs, and then he would roll it up, and then he would dip it in the sauce, the bitter sauce, and then he would hand it to each guest, and he would do that for each guest. The lamb would obviously anticipate the coming of God's Lamb, who would provide salvation for all who would believe. So each part has its own significance. The unleavened bread, the bitter herbs, the lamb meat, each one represents something with has a spiritual connotation to it. And the lamb would, again, represent God's lamb that would be sacrificed for all of us. By the master of the feast presenting the bread to the guest, they were reminded that the guest of God's promise to provide, how many say this again? They were reminding the guest of God's promise to provide salvation. So by the leader of the feast, by him giving each person the Passover meal, the bread and the lamb meat, it would represent God providing salvation for each guest. God is providing salvation for each guest at this meal. As the guest eat the bread, it was an acknowledgement of their sin and their willingness to partake of the salvation which this coming Messiah would offer. So if you were at home and you were a Jewish family and you were partaking of the Passover, the father or the leader of that group of people, he would take the unleavened bread, lay the lamb meat on it, sprinkle bitter herbs. He would roll it up and then dip it in bitter sauce, and then he would give it to each guest at the meal. By him giving this meal to each guest, it represents God providing salvation. And by each guest receiving that meal, it would be representing their receiving of God's provision of salvation. Now, we do not know the seating arrangement around the table, but it seems that John was on Jesus's right side, because John was able to lean on Jesus's breast, and because John 13 verse 26 seems to imply that Jesus gave the first bread to Judas, that Judas was on Jesus's left side. So it seems that John was on Jesus's right side and Judas was on Jesus's left side. And the reason why we believe John was on Jesus' right side is because the Bible says that he was leaning on Jesus' breast. Now, the left side was always known as the place of honor. And Jesus gave Judas this place of honor. So at this Last Supper that Jesus is going to partake of with his disciples, Jesus has Judas, his betrayer, on his left side and at the place of honor. The giving of the bread was a type of offering salvation to the guest. By giving Judas the bread, Jesus was offering forgiveness to Judas if he would accept it, and if he would put his faith in Jesus as the Messiah. So Jesus did give a piece of this Passover meal. He did present it to Judas at his left side. This was probably the greatest example of love and grace anywhere in the Bible. The one being betrayed was offering forgiveness to the one who was doing the betraying. Judas probably took the bread, but it is not stated that he actually ate it. because by eating it, it would be a sign that Judas was accepting Jesus' offer of forgiveness and salvation. Instead of partaking of the bread of Jesus' offer into his heart, it was Satan that entered into him. Judas rejected the offer of salvation and entered into a Christless eternity. Even after Jesus offered the bread to Judas, the disciples still had no idea of the significance of what Jesus just did when he offered that bread to Judas. They probably didn't understand until Judas betrayed Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Verse 21 says, "The Son of Man indeed goes, as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. Good were it for that man if he had never been born." Now, it says here in verse 21, the Son of Man indeed goes as it is written, as it is written. Just because God's sovereign purpose will come to pass because of this betrayal does not exempt Judas from his moral responsibility for what he did. So just because Judas is fulfilling God's plan does not exempt Judas from his sin of betraying the Lord. And then it says here in verse 21, as it is written of him, but woe to that man. Woe to that man. Jesus is not speaking this as a curse or out of resentment or out of anger. When Jesus said, woe to that man, Jesus isn't angry. But perfect love was hurt. Perfect love was rejected. And perfect love could not prevent Judas from what he did. Jesus said, woe unto that man by whom he is betrayed. Woe, because perfect love gave every opportunity for the betrayer to get saved, and he still rejected it. Woe unto that man. Jesus is almost like saying it out of sorrow, because even perfect love could not turn Judas's hard heart. The severity of the punishment, of the eternal punishment that Judas will receive, is seen in Jesus' words. It were better for him if he had never been born. It were better for him. This means that Judas's eternal, I don't mean his time in hell. I mean when after the white throne judgment, and he's cast into the lake of fire, his eternal punishment will be way severe, way severe. When Jesus said it would be better for him if he had never been born, I mean, Jesus didn't say that about anybody else. He didn't say that about anybody else, but he said it about Judas. I mean, Judas, he's not in the lake of fire yet, but he will be. But when he gets there, his eternal punishment is going to be way, way more severe. And then verses 22 to 24, and it says, and as they did eat, Jesus took bread and blessed and broke it and gave to them and said, take, eat, this is my body. And he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank of it. And he said unto them, This is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many. Now, bread in the Old Testament was a symbol of God's provision for his people. Wine was a symbol of joy that would be experienced by those in the coming Messiah's kingdom. Jesus will take bread and wine and give them new significance at this Passover feast. Jesus was doing away with the old way of eating the Passover, and Jesus was beginning a new way of eating the Passover. The old way was looking for the Messiah. The new way is the Messiah has come. Jesus attaches his body to the bread, to the unleavened bread, and his blood to the wine. Then Jesus commands them to eat bread and drink wine in remembrance of him as often as they will. The body is broken for us all. The blood was shed to establish a new covenant in grace, not in law, a covenant in grace. The new covenant was spoken of in Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 34. God promised to forgive sins. Jesus' blood would provide for the forgiveness of sins. The beginning of this new covenant would finish the old Mosaic covenant. The emphasis of Jesus on instituting communion was on the new covenant. Jesus, on the new covenant that he came to establish. So when Jesus instituted us, when we partake of the elements of the bread and the wine, when the bread and that he was instituting a new covenant. It was establishing this new covenant. All right. When we partake of communion, it's to remember his body and his blood. This is partaking of the new covenant. All right. We're going to start verse 26 next lesson. But until then, walk with the Lord. I know he walks with you.